The year is 1814. The streets of France, once busy with the excitement of revolution and Napoleon's armies, now waited for something new. Napoleon Bonaparte, the emperor who had ruled Europe for over 10 years, had been defeated and sent away. He had changed the continent with his ambitious wars, but now his time was over. The French people, tired from years of war and unrest, wanted peace. The streets, once filled with the sounds of fighting, now echoed with the hopes of a nation that wanted stability and to go back to normal.
I, Louis XVIII, brother of Louis XVI, who was executed, stepped into this uncertain time. My return was not just a personal victory, but a sign that the old order was trying to come back in a changed France. I came back to France from exile and became king, marking the start of the Bourbon Restoration. The journey back was full of mixed feelings because I knew the huge task ahead of me.
Louis XVIII knew that France was different now. The revolution had changed the country deeply, and Napoleon's time had further transformed its politics. He knew he couldn't just erase what the revolution and Napoleon had done. The ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity had taken hold, and ignoring them wouldn't work. He created a constitution, the Charter of 1814, which recognized that the people had power and guaranteed certain basic rights. This was a big step in trying to connect the old ways with the new.
Trying to make the old order work with the new, however, would be harder than it seemed. Politics were full of tension, and the arguments were often heated and divisive. Many in France wished things could go back to how they were before the revolution. They missed the days when the monarchy and the church had complete control. These were the ultra-royalists who thought I had given up too much. They believed that any compromise with the revolutionary ideas was a betrayal of the monarchy's God-given right to rule. They wanted the absolute monarchy and the church's power back. They saw France returning to the old ways, where the king's word was law and the church controlled people's lives.
Their pressure on the king would have big consequences for France's future. The struggle between wanting the past back and needing to embrace the future created a dangerous political situation. Not everyone was happy about the Bourbons' return. The streets of France were filled with protests and demonstrations as people showed their unhappiness with the new regime. Many, especially those who had done well under Napoleon, didn't trust the new regime. They were afraid that the progress made during Napoleon's time would be lost. The stage was set for a time of tension and uncertainty as France struggled to figure out its identity after Napoleon. The fight to define what kind of nation France would become was just starting. The fight between tradition and modernity, between monarchy and republic, had only just begun. The future of France was uncertain as the nation dealt with the complicated legacy of its revolutionary past and Napoleon's ambitions. As France dealt with its own restoration, the rest of Europe was also going through a time of big change. The Napoleonic Wars had left the continent in chaos, with new borders and disrupted societies. Europe needed a complete and lasting peace more than ever. After Napoleon's defeat, representatives from the major powers met in Vienna to redraw the map of Europe and prevent future wars. This huge task required careful negotiation and diplomacy, as each nation wanted to protect its own interests, while also working towards a stable Europe. This gathering, called the Congress of Vienna, would have lasting consequences for the continent. It wasn't just a meeting of minds, but a clash of ideologies, with each representative having their own vision for Europe's future.
The Congress was controlled by the winners of the Napoleonic Wars: Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Great Britain. These powers had suffered the most during the conflict and were determined to shape the post-war world. Their leaders, including Metternich of Austria, Castlereagh of Britain, and Tsar Alexander I of Russia, played key roles in the negotiations. Our main goal was to create a lasting peace by restoring a balance of power. This meant making sure that no single nation could control the continent like France had under Napoleon. The idea of balance of power became the most important part of European diplomacy for the next 100 years. We didn't want any single country to become as powerful as France was under Napoleon. This meant not only changing borders, but also creating a network of alliances that could stop any potential aggressor.
To achieve this, the Congress changed borders, brought back old dynasties, and re-established traditional monarchies that had been overthrown during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic periods. This restoration was seen as a way to bring stability and continuity to a continent that had been constantly changing for decades. They also set up a system of alliances. These alliances were designed to provide mutual support and discourage any nation from trying to upset the balance of power. The idea was that a united Europe would be less likely to go back to war. France, although considered a defeated power, was not punished harshly. The Congress recognized that a stable and integrated France was crucial for the overall stability of Europe. Instead of seeking revenge, the goal was to bring France back into the European community as a partner. The Congress understood that a stable France was essential for a stable Europe. By allowing France to keep its status and territory, the Congress hoped to encourage cooperation and mutual respect among the European powers.
The Congress of Vienna successfully prevented a major European war for several decades. The balance of power it created provided a framework for international relations that lasted throughout the 19th century. However, this peace came with a price. Its decisions also created future problems. The strict adherence to the balance of power and the suppression of nationalist and liberal movements created underlying tensions that would eventually explode. The suppression of nationalist movements and the strengthening of conservative monarchies would eventually lead to revolutions across Europe. These uprisings, driven by a desire for self-determination and democratic governance, challenged the very foundations of the Vienna settlement and set the stage for future conflicts.
When Louis XVIII died in 1824, his younger brother Charles X became king. Charles wasn't just taking on a role. He was entering a turbulent era shaped by the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. France was still dealing with the massive changes in power and society that these events had caused. Unlike his brother, Charles was a strong conservative who didn't understand the changes happening in France. He was stuck in the old ways, believing that the monarchy should have absolute power. This was very different from Louis XVIII, who had tried to balance royal authority with some of the revolutionary ideals. He believed in the divine right of kings and had no intention of sharing power with the people. This belief wasn't just a personal opinion but a guiding principle for his reign. He saw himself as the rightful ruler, chosen by God, and therefore above the will of the people. This divine right was an idea that had been challenged more and more by the Enlightenment and revolutionary movements across Europe.
My reign was defined by a series of policies that alienated much of the French population. I tried to restore the old order and reverse the changes brought about by the revolution. This included reinstating privileges for the nobility and the church, which had been taken away during the revolution. I compensated nobles who had lost land during the revolution, limited press freedom, and imposed strict censorship laws. These actions were meant to strengthen the monarchy, but instead, they stifled the growing demand for more democratic freedoms and transparency in governance. I also dissolved the Chamber of Deputies when it opposed my policies. This was a big mistake, as it removed one of the few ways for people to express their political opinions and opposition. The Chamber of Deputies had been a platform where the voices of the people could be heard, and its dissolution only made the public more frustrated and angry.
His actions fueled growing resentment against the monarchy. The people of France, who had experienced some freedom and democratic ideals, were not willing to go back to the old ways without a fight. The streets of Paris and other major cities became centers of dissent and protest. The king's increasingly authoritarian rule reached a breaking point in 1829 when he appointed a cabinet of ultra-royalists. These were individuals who shared his conservative views and were committed to reversing the progress that had been made. This move was seen as a direct insult to the principles of the Charter of 1814, which had promised certain freedoms and a constitutional monarchy. This move was seen as a direct threat to the limited freedoms guaranteed by the Charter of 1814. The Charter had been a compromise, a way to bridge the gap between the old regime and the new order. By undermining it, Charles was essentially declaring war on the very idea of a constitutional monarchy. The stage was set for a confrontation between the king and the people. The tension was clear, and it was obvious that something had to change. The people were no longer willing to accept the autocratic rule of a king who seemed out of touch with the realities of the time. The simmering discontent with Charles X's rule was about to boil over. The streets of France were filled with the cries of a populace that had had enough. The stage was set for a dramatic and unavoidable clash that would shape the future of the French nation. In July 1830, Charles X made a decision that would seal his fate. he issued a series of decrees known as the July Ordinances that dissolved the newly elected Chamber of Deputies, restricted voting rights, and imposed strict censorship on the press. This attempt to crush opposition completely backfired.
The people of Paris, outraged by the king's actions, took to the streets in what became known as the July Revolution. Students, workers, and members of the middle class built barricades, fought with troops, and demanded Charles X's resignation.
The 3 glorious days of fighting left their mark on the city and the monarchy. Facing overwhelming opposition, Charles X abdicated and escaped to England. The July Revolution marked the end of the Bourbon Restoration and brought in a new era in French history. The revolution showed the power of the people and their determination to protect their freedoms. It also highlighted the constant tension between the desire for stability and the desire for change that defined 19th century France. With Charles X gone, France was once again at a turning point. The revolutionaries had won, but what kind of government would replace the monarchy? The answer came in the form of Louis-Philippe, Duke of Orléans, a distant relative of the Bourbons.
Louis-Philippe was a smart politician who knew he needed to adapt to the changing times. He presented himself as the citizen king, a man of the people who would uphold the principles of the revolution. He accepted the Charter of 1814 as an agreement with the nation, not a right given by God.
The July monarchy, as Louis-Philippe's reign became known, marked a change in French politics. The tricolor flag of the revolution replaced the white flag of the Bourbons. The charter was changed to allow more people to vote, though it was still limited to a small part of the population. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of the French, stood as a giant on the world stage. His ambition knew no bounds. He had conquered much of Europe, but his eyes were set on a grander prize, Russia. In June of 1812, Napoleon embarked on a campaign that would seal his fate. He led the Grande Armée, a force of over 600,000 men, into the heart of Russia. This was no mere invasion. It was to be a decisive strike to bring Tsar Alexander I to his knees and solidify Napoleon's control over Europe. The scale of Napoleon's invasion was unprecedented. His army was a vast multinational force drawn from every corner of his empire. It marched east with confidence, its ranks swelled by troops from allied states like Prussia and Austria. Napoleon believed victory was inevitable. He saw Russia as a backward nation, ripe for conquest. He underestimated the resolve of the Russian people and the unforgiving nature of the Russian land. The initial stages of the campaign seemed to confirm Napoleon's optimism. His forces swept through Russia, winning several early victories. The Russians, however, adopted a strategy of strategic retreat, refusing to engage in a decisive battle. Napoleon pressed on, deeper and deeper into the vast Russian interior. Unbeknownst to him, he was marching into a trap laid by both the Russians and the unforgiving Russian winter. The Russians, under the command of General Barclay de Tolly and later General Mikhail Kutuzov, employed a strategy that would become Napoleon's undoing, Scorched Earth. As the Russian army retreated, they burned everything in their wake. Villages were razed, crops destroyed, and wells poisoned. The goal was to deny Napoleon's army the resources it needed to survive. This tactic, while brutal, was highly effective. The Grande Armée, accustomed to living off the land, began to starve. Napoleon pressed on, driven by his overconfidence and a belief that he could force a decisive battle. He captured Smolensk, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. The city was in ruins, offering little in the way of supplies. The Russian army continued its retreat, drawing Napoleon further and further into the vast Russian wilderness. The days grew shorter, and the first signs of winter began to appear. The French soldiers, used to the milder climates of France and Central Europe, began to suffer from the cold. Food shortages became chronic. The once grand army was reduced to scavenging for scraps. Horses died by the thousands, their carcasses left to rot in the snow. Morale plummeted as the reality of their situation set in. Napoleon's dream of a quick, decisive victory was fading with each passing day. The turning point of the campaign came in September 1812 at the Battle of Borodino. Napoleon finally forced the Russians into a major engagement. The battle was a brutal, bloody affair, one of the deadliest battles of the Napoleonic Wars. While Napoleon claimed a tactical victory, it came at a terrible cost. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, and the victory did little to change the strategic situation. Despite the victory at Borodino, Napoleon's situation remained precarious. He had hoped to force the Russians into a decisive battle, but they had slipped away once more. The French army, exhausted and depleted, entered Moscow on September 14th. They found the city largely deserted, and what remained was soon engulfed in flames. The Russians had set fire to their own capital rather than see it fall into enemy hands. With winter approaching and his army starving, Napoleon had no choice but to order a retreat. The retreat from Moscow began in October, and it was a nightmare. The Russian winter descended in full force, bringing with it biting winds and sub-zero temperatures. Food was scarce, and the soldiers, lacking proper winter clothing, froze to death by the thousands. Section 4. The tide turns. From Russia with scars, the road to Leipzig. The retreat from Moscow was a horrifying ordeal. The once mighty Grande Armée was reduced to a shadow of its former self. Stragglers were picked off by Cossacks, who harried the retreating French relentlessly. Those who succumbed to exhaustion or the cold were left behind, their bodies swallowed by the snow. Only a fraction of the original force that had crossed the Niemen River 6 months earlier would ever see France again. The disaster in Russia shattered Napoleon's aura of invincibility. It emboldened his enemies, who now sensed an opportunity to break free from French domination. In 1813, a sixth coalition was formed, consisting of Russia, Prussia, Austria, Great Britain, Sweden, Spain, and Portugal. The stage was set for a final showdown with the French Emperor. The Battle of Leipzig, fought in October 1813, was the culmination of this renewed struggle against Napoleon. It was a titanic clash involving over 500,000 soldiers and raging for 3 days. Napoleon, despite moments of his old brilliance, was ultimately defeated. The Battle of Leipzig, often called the Battle of the Nations, marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon's empire. Section 5. The 100 Days and Waterloo, the final stand of an emperor. The defeat at Leipzig forced Napoleon to abdicate in April 1814. He was exiled to the island of Elba, off the coast of Italy. However, his exile would be short-lived. Sensing an opportunity, Napoleon escaped Elba in February 1815 and returned to France. His reappearance ignited a wave of popular support, and he was able to raise a new army. Thus began the period known as the 100 Days. Napoleon's return to power plunged Europe back into war. The Seventh Coalition, consisting of Britain, Prussia, Russia, Austria, and several other European states, mobilized their armies to confront him. Napoleon, determined to regain his lost glory, marched north to confront his enemies in Belgium. The fate of Europe and of Napoleon himself would be decided on the battlefield of Waterloo. The Battle of Waterloo, fought on June 18, 1815, was Napoleon's last stand. He faced an Anglo-Allied army commanded by the Duke of Wellington and a Prussian army under Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. The battle was a close-run affair, with both sides fighting with incredible ferocity. However, the arrival of the Prussians late in the day tipped the balance in favor of the Allies. Napoleon's army was routed, marking the end of his reign and his career as a military commander. Imagine a kingdom, once mighty, crumbling from within. This was France in the late 18th century. The French Revolution, a time of extreme social and political unrest, changed the course of history forever. It was a time when the old ways, a system of absolute monarchy and aristocratic privilege, were challenged and overthrown by the power of the people. The French Revolution was not a sudden outburst, it was the result of years of simmering discontent. France, despite its outward grandeur, was a nation on the brink of disaster. The seeds of revolution were sown in the very fabric of French society, in the ever-widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. The extravagance of the French court, epitomized by the lavish lifestyle of King Louis XVI and his queen, Marie Antoinette, stood in stark contrast to the plight of the common people. The French peasantry, burdened by taxes and feudal obligations, struggled to survive. Years of economic mismanagement and costly wars had driven France to the brink of bankruptcy. The French monarchy, for centuries a symbol of absolute power, had become increasingly detached from the realities of daily life for most of its citizens. King Louis XVI, though well-intentioned, lacked the decisiveness and political acumen to navigate the growing crisis. His queen, Marie Antoinette, a target of much public scorn, became a symbol of the ruling class's perceived indifference and extravagance. French society was rigidly divided into three estates: The First Estate, made up of the clergy, enjoyed great wealth and privilege, exempt from most taxes. The Second Estate, the nobility, similarly benefited from a system that granted them special rights and exemptions. The burden of taxation fell squarely on the shoulders of the Third Estate, which encompassed everyone else, from wealthy merchants to impoverished peasants.
Resentment towards the privileged classes festered among the common people. The Third Estate, though diverse in its makeup, shared a growing sense of grievance and a desire for change. They yearned for a fairer system, one that recognized their rights and contributions to society.
Across Europe, a new intellectual movement was taking shape, the Enlightenment. Thinkers like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Montesquieu challenged the foundations of absolute monarchy and advocated for the principles of individual liberty, popular sovereignty, and the separation of powers. Their ideas, spread through salons and pamphlets, ignited the imaginations of people across the continent, including France.
The Enlightenment provided the intellectual framework for the French Revolution. It instilled in the French people, particularly among the educated middle class, a belief in the power of reason and the potential for progress. The writings of Enlightenment philosophers gave voice to the grievances of the Third Estate, providing a powerful justification for their demands for reform.
The ideas of the Enlightenment were not confined to the realm of abstract theory. They seeped into the consciousness of the French people, inspiring hope for a more just and equitable society. The American Revolution, a successful rebellion against British rule, served as a potent example of how Enlightenment ideals could be translated into political reality.
Section 4, The Revolution Ignites, Estates General and the Storming of the Bastille. In 1789, facing financial ruin, King Louis XVI was forced to convene the Estates General, a representative assembly of the three estates, for the first time in over 175 years.
The financial crisis has left us with no choice but to convene the Estates General. We must find a solution to this dire situation.
The Third Estate, sensing an opportunity to address their grievances, arrived at Versailles with a list of demands, including fairer taxes and greater representation in government. However, the Estates General, structured to favor the privileged orders, quickly became a source of frustration for the Third Estate. When their demands for reform were ignored, they took the radical step of declaring themselves the National Assembly, the true representatives of the French people. This act of defiance marked a turning point in the revolution. On July 14, 1789, fueled by rumors of royal troops massing outside Paris, a mob of Parisians stormed the Bastille, a royal fortress and a symbol of oppression. The storming of the Bastille, though largely symbolic, had profound consequences. It demonstrated the power of the people and their willingness to resort to violence to achieve their aims. Section 5, Dawn of a New Era, the Declaration of the Rights of Man. In the aftermath of the Bastille's fall, the National Assembly, now firmly in control, set about dismantling the remnants of the old order. They abolished feudalism, stripping the nobility and clergy of their ancient privileges. They drafted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a revolutionary document that proclaimed the fundamental equality of all men and their inalienable rights to liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression.
The Declaration of the Rights of Man, inspired by the ideals of the Enlightenment, marked a radical departure from the old order. It proclaimed that sovereignty resided in the people, not in the king.
It enshrined the principles of popular sovereignty, individual liberty, and equality before the law. The Declaration became a cornerstone of the French Revolution, a beacon of hope for those who yearned for a more just and equitable society. The ideas enshrined in the Declaration were not confined to France. They resonated far beyond its borders, inspiring revolutionary movements across Europe and around the world. The Declaration of the Rights of Man stands as a testament to the enduring power of ideas to shape the course of history.